Officially, there are only 5 mags of the 8th tier, and one of them is Selim Mikalo, the master of the Blue Tower. He had been on a business trip to the northern lands, home to the barbarians, for several months. Upon his return, he immediately sensed something was amiss at the Blue Tower. The first reason was the disappearance of the presence of Shimon, which he always felt upon returning to the tower. The second reason was his disciple, Penia, who was also an 8th tier mage, blessed with a talent that could only be described as dazzlingly gifted. Penia, with her overwhelming talent, had developed an arrogant personality that reached the skies. Although she had shown at least minimal respect to her master Selim in the past, she had become increasingly impudent since she reached the 6th tier at a young age and was appointed as the deputy master of the tower. Her attitude toward him had become more brazen over time. In truth, Selim knew that Penia's behavior wasn't entirely due to disrespect for him. A significant reason was the overwhelming amount of paperwork she had to deal with while he was away on his frequent business trips. Nonetheless, even taking that into account, Penia had achieved too much for her age, and her arrogance had become excessive. However, Selim never intended to correct this behavior. While arrogance is a trait that a mage must be cautious of, especially in the pursuit of knowledge, Penia's arrogance did not extend to her research and studies. Besides, Selim believed that once she reached the 7th tier, her personality would naturally correct itself to some extent. No matter how talented and self-centered a mage might be, they would inevitably become humble upon reaching the 7th tier. At that level, one begins to realize how insignificant their past achievements truly are. And so, Selim had left her be, until now. Privacy settings. You're telling me that Count Palacio came and sealed Shimon? Selim asked. Yes, Penia answered weakly. Selim stared at his disciple. Her usual fierce eyes, which never softened even in front of her master, were now filled with uncertainty. She spoke cautiously, as if wary of something, a very unusual sight. The Count used the oath of magic to seal Shimon, so I can't talk about how it was done. That's right. Penia mumbled, her spirits dampened. Selim, noticing her unfamiliar demeanor, let out a sigh and thought about Count Palacio. Unfortunately, there wasn't much information about the Count in his mind. The Blue Tower was far from the kingdom of Asteria, so what little he knew came from rumors a few years ago. He had heard that the current Count Palacio had murdered all his brothers to claim the title. That was the extent of it. Yet, Selim couldn't help but feel increasingly curious about the Count. He knew that Penia wasn't one to easily bend her arrogance, and her talent only reinforced it. If someone managed to humble her, there was only one possible explanation. Magic that even Penia couldn't fully comprehend, or rather, an origin-level spell. Selim smiled as he came to this conclusion. For the first time, he felt intrigued by this Count from a small, obscure kingdom. The next day, Alone checked a letter from Yusha, which had become a familiar occurrence every month or two. As he read it, he thought, nothing special this time. As usual, Yusha's letter contained mundane details of everyday life. It spoke of her life at the monastery and the recent activities of the 5 deadly sins. Alone, however, preferred these trivial stories over peculiar incidents. The fact that there wasn't anything particularly noteworthy meant that the 5 deadly sins were living quite well. Of course, it was a bit lonely that none of the others bothered to send even a single letter, but Alone understood. It's probably because I've never met them face to face. He had never visited the orphanage, so naturally, he had never met the 5 deadly sins in person. Although he had provided substantial financial support, from their perspective, Alone was likely just seen as a kind benefactor. In fact, he figured they might not even think of him as a benefactor, but rather as just some nice guy from the past. Still, it didn't bother him much. His goal was never to win the affection of the 5 deadly sins. His primary aim was to guide them down the right path, ensuring that they wouldn't destroy the kingdoms. Since that goal had already been achieved, there was no need for regret. Even so, Alone couldn't help but feel a little sentimental. Despite his indifferent exterior, a faint smile of satisfaction crept across his face as he read Yusha's letter. The others had never sent a letter from the very beginning, but Yusha, despite living a nun's life, had consistently written to him once a month. It wasn't much, but the thought of it warmed Alone's heart. It felt like raising 5 children, only for all of them to forget his efforts and never send a single letter, except for the eldest daughter, who still remembered and appreciated his hard work. Privacy settings. Yusha's the only one who truly gets it, he thought to himself. As Alone basked in this oddly sentimental, father-like feeling, there was a soft knock at the door. Knock knock. Evan entered the room. "What is it?" Alone asked. "Oh, I meant to tell you yesterday when I saw you at the training grounds, but it slipped my mind. Remember when you asked me to look into it last time?" "Yes, I remember." As Evan said, Alone had previously asked him to check with the Information Guild to see if the 5 deadly sins were doing well. Although Yusha's letters used to give him a glimpse of what the others were up to, lately, her letters contained fewer details about the rest. "So, did you find anything out?" "Yes, but there wasn't much need to consult the guild. A few of them are pretty infamous now. Especially Deus and Sealrang." Alone motioned for him to continue, and Evan stepped fully into the room, organizing his thoughts before speaking. "First, about Sealrang. I've heard rumors that she's already become a warrior close to the rank of Baba Yaga. She's won 32 consecutive battles. 32 consecutive wins. Yes. That doesn't sound possible. Honestly, I didn't believe it at first either, but the rumors seem to be true. Among those 32 victories, only one fight went beyond 10 exchanges. The other Baba Yagas are getting quite nervous." "That makes sense," Alone nodded in agreement, still stunned by what he was hearing. The title Baba Yaga was an honorable rank in the colony, and there were only 4 individuals who held that title at any given time. The title never increased in number. Therefore, if Sealrang managed to reach the record of 100 wins required to challenge for the title, one of the current 4 would have to face her. If I recall correctly, wasn't the Lion King the fighter with the most consecutive wins in colony so far? Yes, that's right. He had 41 wins, if I remember correctly, Evan confirmed. She's only 9 wins away from surpassing the Lion King. Exactly. Evan nodded as Alone pondered, momentarily imagining the Lion King, who joined as a companion in one of the games. It was then that Alone realized just how absurdly talented the 5 deadly sins were. The colony was home to not only common warriors but also formidable ones. Despite being a military powerhouse that heavily relied on its fighters, even the surrounding kingdoms hesitated to pick a fight with them. Maintaining such a winning streak in a place like that was proof of her talent, and as Alone pondered this with a surprised expression, Evan continued speaking. "Privacy settings. And there's a rumor about Deus as well." "What's the rumor?" "They say that Deus and his order, the Eclipse, recently took down Kurga of the Snow Plains, one of the 8 barbarian chiefs." "One of the 8 chiefs?" "Yes, one of them. You know who they are, right? The monstrous beings who have transcended into superhumans through their rituals, despite being mere barbarians." Even without Evan's explanation, Alone was already familiar with the 8 chiefs. More precisely, he knew just how absurdly powerful they were from the game. To acquire the special magical equipment needed to become a glass cannon in Psychedelia, you had to fight the barbarians and defeat the god they worshipped. Just thinking about it makes me dizzy. For a moment, Alone felt lightheaded, recalling how it had been over 5 years since he encountered Ultultus in the game. Even now, just the thought of Ultultus made his stomach churn due to how powerful it was. According to the law, if Ultultus were to awaken and ascend to a true god, it would gain power comparable to that of the 5 deadly sins. In other words, if Ultultus were to awaken in the north, the kingdoms would be completely overwhelmed, even without the involvement of the 5 deadly sins. However, Alone wasn't too concerned. Luckily, there's no chance of encountering it. As far as Alone knew, Ultultus didn't appear unless the 5 deadly sins descended. In the law, Ultultus only appeared when the gods descended and shattered the laws of the world, merging with the 5 deadly sins. Unless a god descended and broke the laws of the world in a way that even Alone couldn't foresee, there was no reason for Ultultus to appear. Deus is doing quite well for himself, then. It's not just that. Successfully defeating a chief that even a master knight would struggle with has put him on par with the likes of Reinhard, the sword master. Upon hearing this, Alone felt a slight pang of regret. Maybe I should have visited him at least 3 times a year. Thinking about how sweet it would have been to benefit from the connections with a master knight, Alone pushed aside his bittersweet thoughts and listened as Evan updated him on Rhine, who was now working as an appraiser in the Labyrinth City. The Black Imprint. Yes. Rhine's shop specializes in imprinting black marks that enhance relics' abilities. That's interesting. Intrigued by this ability, which he hadn't encountered in the game, Alone marveled for a moment before asking about the last remaining member. What about Layden? In truth, Alone had asked Evan to investigate the 5 deadly sins mainly because of his curiosity about Layden. Although Layden had lagged behind Sealrang, Alone had lost track of him about half a year ago when Yusha's letters stopped mentioning him, Privacy settings. Of course, he wasn't too worried since he'd heard that Leyden had safely arrived in Raxus and was learning the ropes. But the fact that there had been no update since then made him curious. However, I haven't found any concrete information on him yet. The Information Guild has some leads, but they asked for a bit more time, about a week, to verify whether the information is reliable. I see. Alone nodded, feeling a slight sense of curiosity, but he accepted Evan's explanation. 2 weeks later, while Alone was, as usual, researching relics in his office, he found himself debating whether or not to attend the Asteria social gathering, held every 3 years and attended by all the nobles. He was contemplating this while staring at the invitation when Count! The door suddenly burst open without so much as a knock, and Evan rushed in. Alone was about to say something when Leyden. It seems he's become a pirate. What? Alone's face froze at Evan's next words. Have you heard of the 7 Islands? Are you talking about the place where the 7 great pirates dwell near Raxus? Yes. Apparently, Leyden has become the captain of the largest of those islands, ruling over it entirely. Really? Yes. Hearing Evan's confirmation, a particular internet post flashed through Alone's mind, a post he had seen long ago about a child who, after receiving 8 years of consistent UNICEF donations, had gone on to become a Somali pirate. Alone, now frozen with the realization that Leyden had turned into a great pirate, felt like he could truly empathize with the writer of that post. Just to be sure, what's the chance that the information is wrong? It seems there is none. Listening to Evan's words, Alone thought. Why did Leyden suddenly become a pirate? The reason Alone sent Leyden to the port city of Raxus was partly due to his unique talent for tracking, but also because he belonged to the Sea God clan. In the game setting, the Sea God clan was extremely rare, with only a few individuals on the entire continent. Although they looked similar to humans, their true identity was difficult to discern at first glance. However, Alone, who had played through the game multiple times and delved into the lore, knew that Leyden was part of this clan, which is why he recommended the treasure hunter profession to him. As a member of the Sea God clan, Leyden could breathe underwater, and with his tracking ability, Alone figured that if he could retrieve submerged relics, he would easily make money. On top of that, the nature of a treasure hunter meant that once you struck gold, you could live a comfortable life, so Alone even gifted Leyden a relic specialized for tracking. But now, Leyden had become a pirate. Not just any pirate, one of the great pirates of the 7 archipelagos. He's now a bigger figure than the Count of Palacio ever was. Privacy settings. Indeed, Evan agreed. The pirates of the 7 archipelagos were technically more like lords ruling over their respective islands, each of which could be considered a small domain. Moreover, their naval combat prowess was so formidable that even the Empire, known for its military might, couldn't look down on them. The captains who ruled the archipelagos were superhumans, comparable to sword masters or the barbarian tribes, surpassing the limits of ordinary men. Even more concerning was that the current captains were said to be far stronger than their predecessors. As Alone considered all this, a question arose in his mind. How on earth did Leyden manage to kill one of these superhumans? Leyden's talents lay not in combat, so this mystery puzzled him. However, Alone soon arrived at a possible explanation. If Leyden had recovered some of the prime relics from the old era, it might make sense. There were many ancient relics hidden beneath the waters near Raxus, and some of them were extremely powerful. Alone himself had spent 3 days grinding through the treasure hunter minigame just to retrieve one of these relics from the Raxus seabed. Though he eventually grew tired of the minigame and never touched it again, the relic he obtained had been worth the effort. So, if Leyden had used a powerful relic to defeat a captain and take their place, that would be somewhat understandable. Alone pressed his left hand against his eyes for a moment but soon regained his composure. In truth, he had anticipated the possibility of something like this happening as he unleashed other sins into the world. He knew the world wasn't easy enough for everything to go exactly as planned. Still, it left a bitter taste in his mouth, and he let out a quiet sigh. It was summer. Beyond the Sea of Raxus, a vast maritime city and the de facto heart of the Duchy of Corkia, lie 7 archipelagos. These 7 islands, known as the 7 archipelagos to the people, were originally ruled by the first pirate, now remembered as the Pirate King, Chaldean T. Braven. However, after Chaldean's untimely death due to heart disease, the 7 archipelagos were divided among 7 rulers, each ruling their own island, passing their reign down through the generations. This region has since become known as the Pirate Haven of the 7 archipelagos. Leyden, who killed the pirate Alcride Mark Ney, the former captain of the largest island and holder of the title of the Slayer, granted by the Emperor's blessing through sacrifice, became the captain of the first island. Privacy settings. With a low sigh, Leyden looked down at the island. Despite being called a pirate town, the first island was quite well structured. Numerous houses were scattered across the ground, surrounded by cliffs that circled the massive island, and the homes built upon these cliffs made the island look like a giant fortress. However, what filled Leyden's mind wasn't the island scenery, but thoughts of the Great Moon. What exactly is the Great Moon, he wondered. Leyden had never deeply thought about the Great Moon before. Not because he held any deep loyalty to it, but because he simply had no particular interest in it. That didn't mean he wasn't grateful, though. He was fully aware of his circumstances. If not for the Great Moon, he would have been captured by the slave traders and subjected to biological experiments, leading to his inevitable death. Moreover, without the Great Moon, he wouldn't have met Yusha, who helped him unlock his abilities and become what he is today. Still, despite all of this, Leyden felt only gratitude toward the Great Moon, and he obeyed his commands not out of loyalty but rather because of Yusha. For him, the phrase "everything is for the Great Moon" was simply following Yusha's orders. That's why, when the Great Moon first issued a direct command, Leyden felt resistant. Like the former Sealrang, he too thought that going to Raxus had no real meaning. Leyden had too many targets for revenge. He needed revenge against the Black Ones who slaughtered his entire clan on an unknown, nameless island where they had lived in peace. He also needed revenge on the cursed hunter who, after he barely escaped the Black Ones and reached the continent, took advantage of his weakened state, killed his parents, and sold him into slavery. To Leyden, becoming a treasure hunter held no meaning, and the gifts from the Great Moon didn't seem to align with the vengeance he had sworn to enact. At least, until he learned that the captains of the 7 archipelagos were the ones who killed his parents. The reason Leyden realized this truth was simple. All of the current captains of the 7 archipelagos wielded the power of the Sea God clan. Though it was publicly known that they received the Emperor's blessing through sacrifice, the truth was that they offered parts of their own bodies in a sacred ritual to receive power from the sea god Clayad, whom they worshipped. As soon as Leyden realized this, he raced madly to the center of Raxus Plaza. Privacy settings. There, he found the old, torn, and now completely irrelevant wanted posters of the 7 archipelagos pirates. At that moment, Leyden was absolutely certain. The current captains of the 7 archipelagos were the very people who had killed his parents when he was a child. They had gained their power by using his parents' bodies. The moment he realized this, he felt an overwhelming surge of rage, joy, and confusion all at once. Even though Leyden had never shared his story after being rescued by the Blue Moon, it seemed as if the Great Moon had orchestrated everything from the very beginning. As if fulfilling a promise, he had given him the opportunity for revenge. However, just because the opportunity for revenge had come, it didn't mean it could be executed immediately. Objectively speaking, Leyden was currently no match for the captains who wielded the power of Clayad. Though he was strong, his strength wasn't enough to defeat those who had reached the realm of superhumans. As he began contemplating, it didn't take long for Leyden to realize that the answer lay in the gift bestowed upon him by the Great Moon. The gift, known as the Goggles of Amrita, had the ability to illuminate countless relics buried under the sea, making them easier to find. After discovering that some of these relics could compensate for his lack of power compared to the captains of the 7 archipelagos, Leyden realized that everything had been planned from the start. At the same time, he understood the true intention of the Great Moon. Revenge and domination over the 7 archipelagos. The moment he understood this, the Great Moon became more than just a small entity he was grateful to. Not only had it laid out everything before Leyden, but he had also given him the strength to seek revenge. From start to finish, everything had been planned. For the Great Moon, Leyden muttered unconsciously. These words had once been meaningless to him, just a simple phrase without any real significance. But now, for the Great Moon no longer felt hollow. Now, when those words left his mouth, they carried true meaning. For the Great Moon. Only then did they hold the significance of loyalty. About 3 months had passed since the news of the 5th son becoming a Somali pirate had reached him. As the unbearably hot summer began to fade, and the leaves in the forest started turning red, Alone boarded a carriage. Privacy settings. He was on his way to the grand church held every 2 years at the Duke Rotegra's estate. I'd rather skip this if I could. While his body was moving in the carriage, Alone's mind was filled with reluctance. The shadowy reputation of the Count Palacio family had long since faded due to years of inactivity, but what replaced it was mockery, which bothered him. Nevertheless, the reason he went through with it was because all nobles of Asteria were bound by the rule to attend the Grand Church every 2 years. There was a strange rule that required attendance once every 2 cycles unless there was an exceptional reason not to. Thus, Alone found himself in the carriage on his way to the Grand Church, soon to be joined by 2 other nobles. This was a planned arrangement, as mercenaries or bandits often targeted nobles during the Grand Church season, so traveling in larger groups was safer. As nobles, they had enough guards to avoid trouble, but even getting into a fight could cost valuable manpower, so they increased their numbers from the start to avoid any incidents. Through this understanding, Alone naturally traveled with 2 families from the east, and the day passed without any issues. The problem, however, came that night. Count Palacio, isn't it a bit much to have only 1 guard? Is it a financial issue? If you're short on funds, I could offer you some help. Ah. It seems you've inherited your title in a rush, and now your finances are in trouble. Alone stared in disbelief at the 2 nobles who had gone out of their way to openly mock him. Alone already had some understanding of why the nobles blatantly ignored him. Because all the rumors have finally died down. Until now, the nobles had feared Alone because they believed he was the mastermind behind taking down Avalon, which had controlled the vast underworld of the East alongside Leo. However, the nobles no longer considered Alone to be the mastermind. After he became a count, he had done nothing significant for several years. The Palacio Count family, from the time of Alone's grandfather, had always been known as a notorious household that never failed to wield influence in the underworld. The Palacio family had consistently dominated the eastern underworld, though the degree of their control varied over time. But ever since Alone became the count, the Palacio family no longer exerted influence in the underworld. As a result, the current eastern underworld was now divided and devoured by packs of wolves that used to scavenge for the leftover crumbs outside the domain governed by the Palacio Count. Furthermore, the power of the Palacio Count family had also weakened, which was natural. The power they wielded up until now had mostly been fueled by the wealth generated from the underworld. However, since Alone became count, he no longer used money to maintain power. His desired life was not one of grand success in the underworld, but rather, a comfortable and prosperous life that any noble could enjoy. In other words, he had already achieved what he wanted. However, by completely withdrawing from the underworld, rumors began to spread among the nobles. Some speculated that perhaps the current Count Palacio wasn't a mastermind at all, but merely someone who became count by chance. Privacy settings. As time passed and Alone continued to do nothing, the rumor gradually became accepted as truth. Eventually, Alone's reputation had devolved into that of a lucky fool who happened to become count in the place of the real mastermind. Of course, there were still a few nobles who remained suspicious of Alone, but even they had begun to agree with the spreading rumors. After all, it didn't make sense that Alone, if he truly had the power to destroy Avalon in a single day, would not have used that power until now. In any case, Alone had somewhat expected this kind of treatment, but he hadn't anticipated that people would go out of their way to mock him like this. Alone looked up at the 2 nobles, whose faces radiated slyness. He didn't recognize either of them. However, based on the crest engraved on their carriage, it was easy to tell that one was from the Kryld Count family, and the other from the Edlin Count family. They both look old enough, but isn't this too childish? Alone laughed to himself as he noted how aged their faces were. He quickly understood why the 2 nobles had come all this way just to mock him. Ah, I see. This is a gathering of the victims. The Palacio family, notorious as they were, had also been a powerful family in the underworld. As a result, they naturally provided benefits to the surrounding families but also exploited them beyond necessity. The families that were frequently treated like tools were none other than the Kryld Count family and the Edlin Count family. To summarize the current situation, these families, who had suffered under the Palacio family, were now venting their grievances on Alone. Of course, it wasn't Alone but Leo, the first son of the Count family, who had exploited them. In short, Alone had no real reason to be the target of such mockery. But to the 2 nobles who were eagerly mocking him, what mattered wasn't that he was Alone but that he was the Count of Palacio. All those underworld forces you had, did they vanish because you couldn't manage them properly? Looks like you haven't been taking care of your carriage properly either. Would you like to borrow some money? The 2 counts, like anonymous trolls commonly found on online communities, made every effort to scratch at Alone. Alone briefly thought, this is kind of annoying, but he chose to follow his reason rather than his instincts. If he were to fight now, he could easily crush the 2 nobles before him, maybe not slaughter them, but leave them beaten to a pulp. However, doing so would only complicate things. The moment he fought with them, Alone would have to leave the gathering and move separately. And that might lead to unnecessary trouble, like running into bandits. Privacy settings. Clearly, responding to their provocations was exactly what they wanted. There's no need to entertain these fools, Alone decided to ignore them. He wasn't stupid enough to fall into such an obvious trap. That day, Alone ate 2 ears of corn, using the jeers from the 2 counts as background music. Delicious. The roasted corn tasted even better in the slightly chilly weather. It would have been nice to have some butter, Alone mused, staring absent-mindedly at the moonlit sky. For the next few days, the uncomfortable coexistence continued. Every evening, Count Kryld and Count Edlin would emerge to hurl their mocking remarks, and every time, Alone pretended not to care, brushing off their words as if they were nothing. The one who ignores and the one who tries desperately not to be ignored. Naturally, the one who ignored always won. Alone had deeply internalized one of the life lessons he had learned from a certain online community: don't feed the trolls. At least in this place, no one could beat him at that game. Of course, after several days of this, other nobles began to mock Alone as well, whispering that he lacked dignity as a noble or scoffing at him for staying silent under the insults of Kryld and Edlin. But despite this, Count Kryld and Count Edlin, who had been the ones persistently mocking him, were not feeling particularly satisfied. "Damn it," growled Count Kryld. "This is absurd." Count Kryld frowned as he looked at Alone from a distance. Even though they had been mocking him, they were the ones being ignored, which was naturally infuriating. But after a moment of their sour mood, they exchanged low whispers. "Did you confirm?" "Yes, and it seems like he has no additional guards." In truth, the reason the 2 counts had openly mocked Alone wasn't just to vent their frustrations. It was also to assess his security. Even with an artifact to secretly check, there was nothing. It's just that foolish brat and that rogue knight sitting next to him. So the rumors are true after all. It seems certain. If he had any forces, he wouldn't be moving around alone. Then we can proceed with the plan. The reason the 2 counts had been investigating Alone was because they were planning to expand into the underworld. They were well aware that Alone had no interest in the underworld, and that, as a result, it had become overrun by various packs of scavengers. While the rumors about Alone were already widely accepted, the 2 counts, having been tormented by the Palacio family for so long, wanted to confirm the truth for themselves. Privacy settings. They needed to be sure that Alone truly had no power left. After days of checking and confirming that Alone had no personal guards, a smile spread across their faces. The gods are smiling upon us. Indeed. Who would have thought we'd get a chance to step into the underworld? While most nobles hesitated to enter the underworld, these 2 were different. Having once acted as lackeys for the Palacio Count family, they knew full well just how astronomical the wealth circulating within the underworld was. They were well aware of how sweet the taste of power from that realm could be. Now that it seemed the Palacio family had truly become a hollow shell, the 2 spoke excitedly, as if they had already conquered the underworld. In truth, it wasn't impossible for them to seize control of the underworld if they joined forces. After all, the reason they hadn't been able to do so before was not due to a lack of power, but because they had feared the Palacio Count family. Thus, after their lengthy discussion, they turned their attention back to Alone. "If we take control of the back, we should give that fool a gift, don't you think?" "That's an excellent idea. There's a limit to how much one can ignore others. He's probably acting this way because he doesn't understand how dangerous the world can be. We'll have to teach him. Count Kryld has such a fine personality." The 2 counts, wearing fishy grins that were far from noble, as if they had done nothing wrong, were confident that the moment they had been waiting for would come soon. Just as the 2 were about to rejoin the camp where the other nobles were gathered after finishing their private conversation. Monsters! The event happened suddenly. Under the cover of darkness, monsters appeared. It was as if they had been lying in ambush, waiting silently, until a soldier spotted them by chance and shouted. At that moment, monstrous cries echoed from within the forest, as if on cue. Immediately, the mercenaries and knights, as if rehearsed, drew their weapons to protect the nobles. And then, "Wizard, give us light!" A wizard, extravagantly brought along by a noble purely for boasting purposes at this grand church event, responded to the knight's command and cast an orb of light into the sky. In an instant. Privacy settings. The mercenaries and knights, who had been noisy just moments earlier, fell silent. What they saw when the light from the wizard illuminated the dark forest were goblins. Goblins are commonly found in forests. With the strength of a child, they are not dangerous monsters for anyone other than rookie mercenaries. Though the rusty swords and bows they wield can be dangerous, they pose little threat to seasoned mercenaries and knights. Goblins only become troublesome when their numbers swell, but even with dozens of them, they can still be easily driven off. However, this is insane. If their numbers are enough to fill the forest before them, then they are undoubtedly a threat to the knights and mercenaries. Moreover, what heightened the tension for the knights was that the goblins before them were far from ordinary. What on earth is that? A knight's voice, laced with both fear and confusion, was directed at the sight of the goblins. The problem wasn't just that they were goblins, it was their grotesque appearance. Purple crystals were growing all over their bodies, including their heads, as if they had been afflicted by some kind of plague. To make matters worse. Wait, isn't that Mark? Among the horde of goblins, the body of a seasoned mercenary who had been assigned to external surveillance for precautionary measures was being devoured savagely. KRRK. In the hands of a massive goblin was what remained of Mark's body. The mercenaries who saw this sight. This can't be happening. Felt a rising wave of fear within them. Mark, the mutilated corpse in front of them, was a veteran mercenary who could easily handle dozens of goblins on his own. The fact that he had been killed without even being able to report the approach of this massive goblin horde suggested one thing to the mercenaries. The mutated goblins before them were anything but ordinary. The knights, who were holding their weapons alongside the mercenaries, also recognized that this was a dire situation. Even if there were only hundreds of goblins, this fight would be incredibly unfavorable for the knights. Privacy settings. Individually, they might manage, but the knights had nobles to protect now. And goblins were cunning monsters, capable of easily exploiting that vulnerability. While the mercenaries seemed to be paralyzed with fear at the sight of the goblin's strange appearance and Mark's death, the knights who could sense magic were aware of something more. They realized that the goblins before them were imbued with magic power. Even a small amount of magic within a monster significantly enhances its physical abilities, and the knights understood this well. Just as the knights were grimacing at the goblins' bizarre howls and their impending charge. Thud! A wall of stones and rubble suddenly rose from the midst of the goblin horde. All eyes were instantly drawn to it. The wizard, who had cast the light spell, recognized that the wall was a rock wall, a third-tier spell. As the translucent barrier of a second-tier shield formed beyond the wall, the knight's expression shifted from despair to confusion. The goblin's malicious stares were now entirely focused on the wall. Enhance! A calm voice echoed through the air. And then, compress! With a loud cracking sound, the translucent sphere rapidly shrank, distorting the stone wall as it collapsed inward. Thud, thud. In the ensuing silence, the sound of footsteps drew the attention of the knights and mercenaries to one direction. A man was approaching. Even in this life-threatening situation, he appeared completely unfazed, walking with an indifferent expression. The nobles and knights quickly realized that the man was Count Palacio. Vacuum. As soon as his lips moved again, the round shield transformed into a rough, rock-like shape, about the size of a soccer ball you might find by the roadside. And then, return to origin. With Alone's final words, the bracelet on his wrist began to emit a faint grey light. Boom! The compressed stones exploded outward like a shotgun blast, tearing dozens of goblins to pieces. Privacy settings. It all happened in an instant. The nobles, knights, and mercenaries stood in stunned silence, their mouths agape as they watched the magic-infused goblins get shredded into mere lumps of flesh. Among them, Count Kryld and Count Edelin's eyes widened as if they were about to tear apart. With all eyes now on Alone, he simply said, "Stop standing there in a daze and get ready." His voice was calm as he looked ahead. The knights and mercenaries, as if mesmerized, raised their swords. The fear that had been spreading in their hearts had, as if by magic, vanished entirely. The battle with the goblins ended in victory. Thanks to the knights and mercenaries responding calmly, the front lines held strong, and Alone's magic once again destroyed a detachment of enemies who were moving to attack the nobles from behind, quickly tilting the battle in their favor. Of course, with hundreds of mutated goblins, there were casualties, but the number was small given the scale of the battle. The final blow came when a knight pierced the head of the last goblin, ending the battle completely. As soon as the soldiers confirmed the battle was over, they sighed in deep relief and turned their gazes toward Alone, who was looking down at the goblin corpses. Despite having just fought a life-or-death struggle, he remained expressionless, as if the battle had left no impact on him, causing the mercenaries to look at him with awe. They couldn't forget the sight of Alone turning dozens of goblins into mere chunks of meat without even changing his expression. However, while the knights and mercenaries admired Alone, he was thinking, "I nearly died in a single strike." Though his face showed no sign, inside he was working hard to calm his wildly racing heart. Despite bearing the insignia of the impure, which allowed him to cast 3 times more spells than usual, after using walls and shields twice each, he had been reduced to a mere mortal due to the limitations of his mana capacity. It's a good thing the knights won, he thought. Though the odds of the knights and mercenaries losing were slim, even against mutated goblins, when he had lost all means of self-defense, he had felt a desperate fear. Perhaps I should have just dropped out earlier. No, it was a good thing I stayed close, but more importantly, Alone praised his past self for acting rationally and, having calmed his heart, turned his gaze to the goblin before him, his expression growing serious. He knew all too well the significance of the purple amethyst emerging from the goblin's body. Why a divine descent? Privacy settings. This was a strange phenomenon that occurred among the monsters of the continent when an outer god tried to descend upon the world. The monsters affected by divine descent became more ferocious and physically stronger. While the current group of soldiers could handle the monsters they would encounter on their journey to the Duke's territory, Alone was concerned about the fact that the divine descent had occurred at all. The phenomenon meant that an outer god would soon descend upon the land. Typically, such gods could not descend unless one of the 5 great sins manifested, but now, even these borderland gods were about to arrive. This can't be good. The descent of outer gods was a grave matter for Alone. While not as catastrophic as the great sins, if these gods started rampaging, entire kingdoms could vanish easily. There were only 6 kingdoms on the continent excluding the Empire, meaning a 1/3 chance that his future plans would be destroyed. In fact, if he were lucky enough to even be able to think about his future at that point, he would consider it fortunate. Alone's expression grew serious as he stared at the goblin. However, there were others who looked even more serious than Alone, so serious, in fact, that their expression seemed to suggest they had lost everything. Those individuals were Count Kryld and Count Edelin. A few days after the appearance of the mutated goblin, with only 1 day left until their arrival at the Duke's estate, Alone experienced 2 changes in that short time. One was that the nobles, who once looked at him with blatant contempt and ridicule, especially when Counts Kryld and Edelin made their snide comments, no longer displayed such expressions. The second change was, "Count Palacio, this is some meat I brought from my estate. Would you like to try it? Count, if it pleases you, I could offer some support to your domain. What do you think?" Count Kryld and Count Edelin, who had spent the past few days mocking Alone, were now fawning over him, trying to curry favor. The 2 counts, who now seemed ready to give Alone anything he wanted, clung to his side, flattering him with servile smiles, while Alone remained indifferent. But the counts were desperate, truly desperate. The display of power Alone had shown just days ago was too strong to dismiss as mere luck when claiming the title of Count Palacio. Moreover, they still remembered what the 3rd-tier mage, whom Baron Amorn had brought to flaunt his wealth, said that night, that Alone's magic was undoubtedly beyond a 2nd-tier level. Upon hearing that, both counts began to reconsider the rumors circulating in society, wondering if they were wrong about Alone. While there were still some unresolved doubts, that no longer mattered. What was important was that the 2 counts had realized Alone was hiding a power strong enough to not need protection. This meant the power that had supposedly wiped out Avalon in a single day, the power held by Count Palacio, could be real. With this realization, their only option was to quickly win Alone's favor. While some might argue that it would be better to investigate the situation thoroughly before making any moves, this didn't apply to those who knew the Palacio family well. The 2 counts, having witnessed firsthand the brutality of the Palacio family's notorious behavior, knew how cruel they could be. Although Alone, the 3rd son, had never shown such behavior himself, the counts were convinced that Alone shared the family's cruel and ruthless nature. After all, the Palacio family had been full of miscreants since his grandfather's time. Privacy settings. Thanks to this, Alone had enjoyed a luxurious lifestyle in recent days. Instead of sweet potatoes and corn, he ate meat for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and the wine they occasionally brought along was also excellent. However, despite receiving these gifts for several consecutive days, Alone's expression did not soften, still preoccupied with thoughts of the goblin from a few days ago. Who could it be? No matter how much Alone pondered, no clear answer emerged. The divine descent was merely a sign that an outer god was about to descend, and there was no way to know exactly which god or when and where it would occur. Although it was meaningless to dwell on it, Alone couldn't help but worry, knowing that his future plans could be completely ruined in an instant. He could go from being a noble to a commoner in the blink of an eye, which was why he couldn't stop thinking about it. I'll have to gather as much information as I can once I reach the estate. As he thought this, he glanced at the nobles beside him, who were eagerly trying to make up for their previous behavior, even at the expense of their pride. He was once again reminded of the Palacio family's infamous reputation. I didn't think they would react this way over just a slight doubt about a rumor. As Alone watched the Count's desperate display, he realized how deeply the rumors about his family had affected them. However, despite understanding their fear, he had no intention of easing their anxieties. Alone considered himself cool-headed, but he also had a petty side. The Count's performance finally came to an end when Alone arrived at the Duke Rotegra's estate. As soon as Alone arrived at the Duke Rotegra's estate, what greeted him was an absurdly large mansion, no, multiple mansions. How many mansions are there inside this estate? Of course, the rich would have this many, he thought, as he noticed the variety of mansions, almost as if someone with diverse tastes in interior design had collected them. Alone soon realized that all these mansions belonged to the Duke's concubines, causing him to shake his head in disbelief. How does his body even survive? He wondered briefly, but upon arriving at the ballroom in the middle of a grand party, he was once again shocked. Everything he saw screamed wealth. Even the wine glasses, which one wouldn't normally pay much attention to, were rimmed with gold. The chandeliers, made entirely of gold, made Alone feel the urge to steal one and sell it as he wandered around the ballroom. Naturally, the ballroom was filled with many nobles. As expected, the Duke of Rotegra, who appeared incredibly thin, was there chatting with numerous nobles. Alone didn't bother trying to join their conversations. It wasn't hard to guess that there would be no benefit in doing so, especially in this ballroom, which felt even worse than the previous one he had attended. Instead of mingling, Alone decided to stand nearby, snacking on food and eavesdropping on the nobles' conversations. After all, his servant, Evan, had already gone off to contact the Information Guild as soon as they arrived at the estate. As Alone savored a dessert that resembled an egg tart alongside some wine, he overheard an interesting piece of news from the nobles' conversation. Privacy settings. Baron Daldoran, have you heard the news? What news do you mean? You know, the rumor that Duke Alsha and Count Zenonia not only formed an alliance but are also trying to establish a faction. Ah, that rumor? Yes, I've heard about it. The two nobles, acting as though they were discussing some great secret, moved to a corner and began whispering. However, with his enhanced hearing, Alone could easily pick up their conversation. But is that true? I couldn't believe they had allied in the first place. If they really form a faction, they could overpower all the current factions combined. Exactly. It might be something unprecedented. Alone was a little surprised upon hearing this, but his expression didn't change much. Even if such rumors were true, he didn't think those two would be able to maintain their alliance for long. As he pondered this, Alone couldn't help but widen his eyes in surprise at the delicious taste of the egg tart in his mouth, nodding in approval. This is good. Without hesitation, he grabbed another and popped it into his mouth. However, just then, the conversation he was listening to took an even more interesting turn. But that's not the real issue. What do you mean? Is there an even bigger rumor? Of course, I wouldn't have started if there wasn't. What is it, then? This is something I heard very discreetly, so don't go spreading it around. I've heard that neither Duke Alsha nor Count Zenonia is the leader of this faction. What? Then who is? Count Palacio. Count Palacio. Yes, the leader of the faction is said to be Count Palacio. Is that true? Of course. Do you think I would lie about something like this? What? Hearing this, Alone instinctively turned to look at the nobles discussing the secret and found himself gaping in shock at what they had just revealed. The cold northern lands, a place where no living being should be able to survive, was gripped by an unrelenting, life-draining frost. In this bleak, cursed land, painted eternally in shades of grey by the relentless blizzard, a man had fallen. Where his right arm should have been, a crimson stain of blood marked the spot, and his left eye socket lay empty. This man was none other than one of the 8 barbarian chieftains, the great Kulkan, now awaiting death after his defeat at the hands of the cowardly knights of Caliban. Yet even in his final moments, his eyes were filled with rage. Those dishonorable dogs, he cursed, but not because of his defeat. To the barbarians, death in battle was a glorious end, a noble fate. Clocan's fury stemmed from the dishonorable way he was struck down, caught in an ambush, tricked by the knight's deceitful challenge to a duel. Cough! Blood spilled from Clocan's mouth as his world grew dim. The grey landscape blurred, and his ears gradually stopped hearing the bitter winds. Despite his anger, his mind slowly began to sink into darkness. Just as everything was about to fade into nothingness, Clocan whispered the name of the great god, Ulfaltus. At that very moment, time seemed to stop. The dim, fading vision cleared, the harsh northern wind blew in his ears once again, and his mind, slipping into unconsciousness, began to rise. Privacy settings. Child of blood, a voice echoed. Call my name. Call upon the great name that you worshipped. Call upon my name, and I shall grant you what you desire. As if commanded by a divine force, Clocan, entranced, murmured, Ulfaltus. And in that moment, the god smiled. Somehow, I became the hidden mastermind of Asteria after waking up, after hearing something that seemed to fit such a title. Alone closed his gaping mouth and mumbled to himself. However, the sweetness he had felt just moments before was completely gone. What kind of nonsense is this? A flurry of question marks swirled in Alone's mind as he tried to comprehend the rumors he had just heard. It made no sense to him. If he had been associating closely with Duke Alsha or Count Zenonia, both of whom were currently forming new factions, he might have understood the basis for such rumors. However, the issue was that Alone had never once met either of the two nobles. He had only seen Duke Alsha once when she was still a young lady at a ball, and as for Lady Zenonia, he had encountered her but had never met the Count himself. In other words, the rumor lacked plausibility, to the point of being entirely baseless. Alone, who had been slowly moving his lips while deep in thought, soon concluded that the notion of him exchanging secret talks with other nobles was nothing more than an absurd, groundless rumor. After all, suspicions could only arise if there was a pre-existing relationship. But since Alone had no connection whatsoever with those individuals, he didn't even feel the need to entertain any doubt. So, just as Alone reached for a cookie next to the egg tart, a voice called out. Count Palacio. Alone turned his head toward the voice and looked beside him. There stood a man dressed in expensive clothing, his face full of mockery. Who is this guy? Alone briefly scanned the man. With his long, curly hair draped to one side, it was easy to tell that the man's character was twisted in a way that was different from the Palacio family, but Alone couldn't gather any more information than that. At the very least, Alone had no information on him in his mind. Oh, I haven't introduced myself. I am Carmine, the third son of Duke Comelin of the Ashtalon Kingdom. Privacy settings. As soon as he noticed Alone didn't recognize him, Carmine's expression briefly faltered before he introduced himself. Alone paused in confusion, then nodded in understanding. After all, he had heard that foreign nobles occasionally visited the grand church where most of Asteria's nobility gathered. Count Palacio, Alone responded with a polite greeting. I've heard of you. You were fortunate enough to become a count, weren't you? Alone blinked in surprise at Carmine's immediate mocking tone. He had suspected from the start that this wasn't a friendly encounter based on the man's demeanor, but he hadn't expected him to launch straight into open ridicule, as if he had no sense of tact or intelligence. Just as Alone was processing this, another voice interrupted from a different direction. Excuse me, but what are you saying right now? Turning toward the new voice, Alone found a familiar face, unlike with Carmine. Marquis Mardinho. Alone recognized him not by his face but by the emblem emblazoned on his chest, and the fact that he had the distinct appearance of a middle-aged man. Are you insulting a noble of the Asteria kingdom right now? Alone's face showed bewilderment at this sudden and unexpected defense. Carmine, the third son of Duke Comelin of the Ashtalon kingdom, was not in a particularly good mood that day. There were many reasons for his foul mood, but the biggest one was that the marriage proposal with the fifth daughter of Duke Lotiga, which he had worked hard to arrange, wasn't going well. Of course, the reason the proposal fell apart was purely due to Carmine's childish behavior and antics that made him appear immature. He had made the foolish mistake of evaluating the appearance of other noble women in front of the fifth daughter herself. As expected of a spoiled child raised without discipline, instead of acknowledging his mistake, Carmine became even more displeased when the lady suggested reconsidering the proposal. If this had not been the kingdom of Asteria, a close ally, or if it hadn't been Duke Lotiga, with whom numerous secret dealings were being conducted, Carmine would have already flipped the situation upside down. Of course, on the flip side, Carmine had no idea that the only reason Duke Lotiger was turning a blind eye to his behavior was because of the very secretive relationship he had with Duke Commelin. In any case, with his mood soured, Carmine had come to the ball, hoping to lift his spirits, when he spotted Count Palacio and decided to pick a fight. Privacy settings. There was only one reason he started the altercation, to vent his already foul mood. Of course, there were plenty of servants and knights around him who could have been ignored or ridiculed, but Carmine didn't find any pleasure in toying with them. It wasn't that his character was admirable, but rather that playing with toys he could easily destroy at will didn't offer him any amusement. For nobles like him, those not of noble birth were treated as no more than that. In that sense, Count Palacio was a perfect stress reliever for Carmine. From what Carmine had heard, Count Palacio was just a clueless boy who had luckily become a count, with no close allies among the nobility. Though even a rascal like him understood that this was not his own territory, he had carefully thought through who he could safely target without any consequences. And so, as soon as he saw Palacio, he initiated the confrontation. Do you realize how disrespectful it is to insult a noble of the Kingdom of Asteria? That's not what I... The Kingdom of Ashtelon has been our ally for a long time, but that was based on mutual respect. Have the people of Ashtelon forgotten what respect means? No, that's not. So, are you saying that Duke Commelin of Ashtelon views Asteria in such a light? Absolutely not. Then why are you addressing a noble so disrespectfully without having even properly succeeded to your own title? That... Carmine's face twisted in confusion. Contrary to the rumors he had heard, the moment he picked a fight with Count Palacio, the other nobles started to rally around him, chastising Carmine. As his face grew more bewildered, Carmine turned his gaze toward Alone, hoping for support, but even Alone was staring at the situation in a state of confusion, his typical expressionless face now mixed with perplexity and bewilderment. What is this situation? Carmine then looked at the three nobles defending Alone. One was Marquis Mardinho, another was Duke Lotiger, and the last was Count Palin. Alone easily recognized them, not only because of their crests but also because they were highly influential figures within Asteria. Marquis Mardinho was a prominent figure among the royalist faction. Privacy settings. Duke Lotiger, on the other hand, was a major figure within the aristocratic faction. As for Count Palin, he maintained political neutrality, but that very position had allowed him to accumulate considerable power. Even if Alone had no interest in politics or noble affairs, it was impossible for any noble in Asteria not to know who they were. Is Duke Commelin truly looking down on us? That's not the case. Then why did you speak so disrespectfully to Count Palacio? I've been disrespectful. Disrespect isn't the issue here. The point is, why did you make such condescending remarks to Count Palacio? Watching the nobles closing in on Carmine with their well-practiced political maneuvering, Alone, who had never been involved in politics, suddenly recognized the situation. I'm sorry. Does apologizing end your military service? I'm sorry. I asked, does apologizing end your military service? Ah, this is it. As this vivid memory from over 10 years ago flashed through Alone's mind, he unknowingly began to sweat. I've been disrespectful. Carmine, unable to endure the pressure from the nobles any longer, fled the ballroom as if in retreat. As soon as he left, the nobles quickly approached Alone and started speaking to him. Count Palacio, are you all right? I'm fine, but... Alone looked at the three nobles, wondering why they were being so kind to him. However, look at that. It seems they've already heard the rumors. Seems like the rumors are true if even those big shots are getting involved. If Duke Alsha and Count Zenonia get involved in politics, they'll be unstoppable. But look at the other nobles, they seem confused. It's still a secret, so be careful what you say. Where on earth do you hear things like this? There are ways. Thanks to his heightened hearing, Alone overheard the hushed conversation of the noble who had been secretly whispering earlier. It was only then that he began to piece together what was happening and realized how absurd the situation was. Privacy settings. Now that I think about it, I haven't had the chance to talk with you, Count. I understand, though, as you're probably very busy. Marquis Mardinho, speaking as if he knew everything, chuckled and continued the conversation. Alone began seriously contemplating whether or not he should clarify that the rumors were baseless nonsense. After all, not doing so could lead to unnecessary complications later on. But then again, speaking up now might make the situation even more awkward. As Alone mulled over what to do, By the way, I heard you're studying magic, Count. Is that true? That's correct. Then I thought I might give you a small gift. Among the artifacts I acquired after clearing out some orc hordes, there's one that stores magical energy for later use. How does that sound? Now that you mention it, I also prepared a little gift. Silence followed as Alone listened to the nobles. That day, Alone ended up receiving 2 magical artifacts and 5 mana restoration potions from the 3 nobles. Meanwhile, as these influential figures gathered around Alone, leaving the other nobles bewildered, Count Kryld and Count Edlin closed their eyes tightly in despair, thinking, "Did we mess with the wrong person? This is really bad." For days after the banquet began, as Alone's collection of spoil steadily grew, an outer god descended in the north. Yes, that's the information I received. Apparently, the purple crystal is also connected to the outer god, but they say they don't know for sure as the information comes from ancient texts. Regardless, it's thrown Caliban into chaos. With only 2 days left in the banquet, Alone, having gathered this intel through the Information Guild, started contemplating something. And then, without hesitation, he made a decision. Evan. Yes. Once the banquet is over, complete the tasks we need to finish, and then we're heading straight to Caliban. He had made up his mind without any doubt. Suddenly? Wait, more importantly, in Caliban. Evan, wearing a deeply confused expression, spoke while thinking for a moment. Then, as if realizing something, he hesitantly opened his mouth. Don't tell me you're planning to go to the north. Evan spoke, recalling that Caliban was the closest country to where the northern barbarians resided. I'll explain on the way. Just prepare first. The information I mentioned earlier, it's accurate, right? If you're talking about the person we discussed last time, yes. The Information Guild confirmed they're in that village. Evan, speaking with an anxious expression. Then we'll stop there before heading straight to Caliban. But at Alone's firm statement, Evan, with a mixture of curiosity and resignation in his eyes, looked at him for a moment before leaving the room to follow orders. Huh? Alone let out a deep sigh, covering his face with his hand as if just thinking about it was exhausting. It was because the descent of an outer god was akin to a massive disaster that he desperately wished would never happen. An outer god. Privacy settings. These beings, known by various names across the continent of psychedelia, were evils that, much like the 5 great sins, merely descending into the world brought calamity. For Alone, their descent alone was enough to shatter his future plans completely. Once they began rampaging in earnest, they could easily destroy entire kingdoms. Of course, with 6 kingdoms on the continent, the odds of being affected were about 1/3. But still, even thinking rationally, there was a 33.3% chance that he would lose his noble title and end up living as a beggar. In fact, by that point, living as a beggar might even be fortunate. If an outer god attacked Asteria, his chances of surviving were slim to none. If, by some small chance, the outer god destroyed 2 other kingdoms instead of Asteria, the situation might improve slightly, but it wouldn't be ideal. The collapse of 2 kingdoms would lead to the rapid fall of the United Kingdoms, and the surviving kingdoms would fight each other madly over worthless land tainted by the powers of the otherworld. With tens of thousands of casualties and over a dozen heroes already lost to the outer gods, the remaining kingdoms would naturally weaken, and in the end, the Empire would devour them all. In short, no matter how you looked at it, if an outer god descended upon the United Kingdoms, Alone would have to give up his noble title. And in some ways, the latter scenario might be even worse. While the former would end quickly, the latter would drag him into a full-scale war. Sure, some might suggest the United Kingdoms could band together in unity during such a crisis. But having played this game long enough and having seen hundreds of scenarios, Alone could confidently shake his head. In every scenario where an outer god or one of the 5 great sins destroyed even a single kingdom, the dissolution of the United Kingdoms was inevitable. Other small details might change, but the collapse of the Union never did. In other words, for Alone to prevent his life plans from crumbling, he had to stop the outer god before it reached the kingdom. HMPH. As soon as Alone heard that an outer god had descended, he knew he had to act immediately. He had a plan. I have to resolve this within 2 months. When an outer god first descends to the mortal world, it cannot fully wield its power as an avatar and requires a 2-month stabilization period before it can awaken as a saged god and fully access its abilities. Privacy settings. Thus, there was a small window of time before it became a saged god, during which stopping it would be somewhat easier. Though, even before becoming a saged god, it wasn't exactly weak. He quietly recalled a part of his mind where all the game-related information, except for what was necessary, had gathered dust. If it's the North, then it would be the god of duels, Ultultus. Before becoming a saged god, he wouldn't be able to use formation attacks, so that's a bit of a relief. But normally, to purely suppress him with force, you'd absolutely need at least 5 sword masters and 1 archmage. Alone silently shook his head. Of course, gathering that kind of power was impossible in the current situation. However, despite this, Alone's expression didn't falter. Ever since the moment the monsters were possessed by a god, he had half expected this situation to come. He already had a plan to eliminate the outer god. I'm not sure if it will go according to plan, but there was no time to dwell on such things. After thinking this far, Alone opened a drawer in the inn where he was staying, took out some stationery, and immediately began writing a letter. 10 minutes later. I guess I should prepare a gift as well. After finishing the letter, which was addressed to Master Knight Deus Macalian in Caliban, Alone stood up. That late afternoon, 2 days before the banquet, Count Palacio left Duke Rotegra's castle. That night, at Duke Alcia's rarely visited residence, which Duke Rotegra had kindly offered for her use, she finally arrived and was having a conversation with a man. You're saying Count Palacio has already left? Yes, that's correct. When the man, Marquis Mardanio, nodded, Duke Alcia, or Lauria, spoke again. So, how did it go? Fortunately, he accepted the gift well. At the Marquis's words, Alcia smiled. That's a relief. For nobles, gifts are generally ceremonial and don't hold much significance. However, that only applies to trivial gifts. Expensive items, like relics, always carry deeper meanings. In Marquis Mardanio's case, the gift he presented to the head of a new faction held a single message: "May I join your faction?" Privacy settings. Of course, directly asking would be more straightforward, but noble society is all about appearances. For example, if someone were to ask directly and be rejected, it would be a blow to their dignity. That's why both the giver and the receiver communicate symbolically through what could essentially be called a bribe, making it easier for both parties to handle. Accepting the gift means approval, rejecting it means refusal. Of course, Count Palacio, or Alone, knew nothing of this. He had only attended a ball once in his life, had no friends, and his father, who died of an overdose, left him ignorant of such matters. As a result, Alone simply thought, even if they realize later, it's not like I'll see them often, and it'd be awkward to ask for it back after accepting, right? With that in mind, he readily took the gift, fully intending to keep it. Now we can officially align our interests. It's an honor. How did the others fare? Those who pledged their allegiance also accepted the gifts. Thanks to Alone's ignorance and his willingness to keep the gifts, Alcia was able to gain the support of the nobles she had given prior notice to. Then we can start making serious moves now. With a small smile, she began preparing for the true formation of her faction. Exactly 1 week after Alone left Duke Rotegra's estate, he arrived in Parkran, a small village in the northern part of the kingdom of Ashtalon, located some distance from the Rotegra estate. Alone had come here for one reason. Hello. It was to meet the protagonist of this dark fantasy roguelike game, Psychedelia. Do you know who I am? No. The reason Alone wanted to meet Eliban, the protagonist of the game, even though the 5 great sins had already been eliminated and the protagonist was no longer essential, was simple. Even without the 5 great sins, the protagonist would still become famous, and Alone judged that it wouldn't hurt to win his favor early on. Especially now, with an outer god having descended, Alone wanted the protagonist to grow quickly. So he came loaded with items to aid Eliban's early growth. Eliban, right? Yes, that's me. As Alone watched the boy speak with a bright smile, so cheerful that anyone might find it refreshing, he thought to himself, he's almost too good looking for a guy, but, well, he looks just like the illustration. Privacy settings. In Psychedelia, the player's choices allowed them to freely adjust the protagonist's gender. That thought briefly crossed Alone's mind, but then he felt a strange sense of dissonance. Was the protagonist always like this? Since Psychedelia was a dark fantasy game, he remembered that while Eliban's personality was lively compared to other dark fantasy characters, he didn't recall him being this bright. He felt a bit puzzled. But that feeling passed quickly. Take this. Alone naturally pulled out a few gold coins from his pocket and handed them to the boy. Ooh? For me? Eliban's eyes widened in disbelief as he received the gold coins, which were enough to support a typical household for 2 months. But Alone didn't stop there. He soon began handing over one item after another, explaining the gifts he had prepared for Eliban over the past week. After a lengthy explanation and handing over all the items he had collected, Eliban, with a puzzled look, asked, "But why are you giving me all this?" Seeing Eliban's confused expression, Alone hesitated for a moment before replying, "It's an investment." "An investment?" "Yeah. You're going to be big one day." In truth, Alone was hoping that Eliban might deal with any future outer gods for him, but he didn't voice that part. "I'm Count Palatio," Alone added, letting Eliban know the name of the benefactor he should be grateful to when he succeeded, before climbing into his carriage without hesitation. "Thank you, Count. No, Sir Count." Eliban, looking bewildered by the sudden meeting and parting, soon watched the departing carriage and gave a respectful farewell. Shortly afterward, "I can roughly guess what you're trying to do, but isn't this all a bit rushed?" Evan remarked, watching how quickly Alone had passed all the gifts to the protagonist. "We don't have time. Besides, he's smart enough to figure it out." Alone spoke while recalling Eliban's backstory. He had considered staying in the village for a few days to build rapport with Eliban, but unfortunately, time wasn't on his side. So he made this choice, and Evan nodded in agreement. "Yeah, well, he does seem incredibly talented. I mean, for a kid, his magic power is really strong." "Ooh? Magic power? Yeah, you didn't notice?" It looked like his magic was oozing out of him. Plus, even though he's dressed like a village boy, it seemed like he had an artifact with him too. Privacy settings. Hearing Evan's words, Alone recalled his memory of Eliban. "Come to think of it, I did sense a bit of magic power. But wasn't Eliban supposed to be just a random village boy before starting his adventure?" Recalling the game's starting setup, Alone tilted his head in confusion. It seemed odd for Eliban to have magic power and an artifact at this stage, but Alone brushed it off. "Well, he's the protagonist, so I guess he can have a bit more talent than usual." With that thought, Alone stopped worrying about Eliban. He had given everything he could, and if the protagonist became stronger, it would only benefit him. After all, Eliban was one of the few characters with a kind heart in this cruel dark fantasy world. Because of that. How long will it take to reach Caliban from here? About another week. 10 days at most if we're delayed. I wish I could get some help. Alone listened to Evan's words as he headed toward Caliban. Meanwhile, at the large mansion in the south of Caliban, Deus, who had returned from the northern expedition and was resting, was preparing to leave for the north again the next day because of foreign news. After reading the letter. "Vice Captain." "Yes. The northern expedition is postponed for 2 weeks. He immediately gave the order. "May I ask the reason for the postponement?" At the vice captain's question, Deus fell silent for a moment. "Soon, a benefactor will arrive." He muttered those words.